Few men in human history have amassed fortunes comparable to those of Andrew Carnegie, a man who was as complex as he was wealthy. His net worth after selling his business would be at a startling 2% of the GDP of America. In this video, we'll look at how one Scottish immigrant managed to escape poverty and become the richest man in the world with only 5 years of education. Although he wasn't born in the country, Carnegie once held the record for being the richest American in history. In Dunfermline, Scotland, where he was raised in what can only be described as abject poverty, Andrew's journey begins on the other side of the Atlantic. Before the steam-powered loom entered the picture, his mother would stitch shoes around the clock, while his father would crate cloth and other materials and weave looms. His father's loom company would fail due to the rapid advancement of weaving technology, and he would be destroyed by the Industrial Revolution. The young Carnegie would be greatly impacted by witnessing his father's suffering as he begged for a job. The Carnegie family emigrated from Scotland in 1848 in hopes of a better life abroad. The family started their voyage to the land of opportunity, America, after selling all of their goods and borrowing £20. In Pittsburgh, a center for manufacturing, they would start over with their lives, but they would still find themselves unable to flee adversity in their new land. Andrew had little choice but to leave school to help his family because his father and mother both had difficulty finding employment. When he got a job in the neighborhood telegraph office, he would finally get a reprieve from the oppressive heat of the boiler rooms. He would ride his bike all across Pittsburgh as a messenger boy, delivered telegrams. In order to be able to greet each recipient by name if he ran into them outside of work, he would memorize the faces of everyone he delivered to. Carnegie would have a rare chance to become acquainted with the city's commercial community. At age 17, he would become an expert telegrapher. He would become more adept at understanding Morse code. He was able to recite messages verbatim, which was impressive, without having to write them down. Thomas Scott, a regional manager for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, was interested in this and employed Carnegie as his personal telegrapher and a private secretary for $35 per month. Pennsylvania Railroad Company was the biggest company in the world at the time. It presented the business-savvy Carnegie with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to observe a successful company in action. His supervisor, Tom Scott, saw Carnegie's promise and made the decision to take the young man under his wing and care for him like a second parent. Later, it would be Tom's recommendation to buy stocks that gave Carnegie his first experience with capitalism. When the American Civil War breaks out, Carnegie is selected for the Union Army, but Carnegie would make money from the war instead of participating in it. Having paid $850 for a replacement to take his position on the battlefield, he was able to get away from danger. Carnegie became aware of the urgent need for iron bridges at this time because the soldiers were prone to burning the wooden bridges, which were in great need of replacement. His Keystone Bridge Company was established when he took advantage of the chance. The action he took after that, however, would prove to be what made him a shrewd businessman. The iron used to create the bridges was provided by Keystone's very own iron mills, which they also owned in addition to building the bridges. Being the owner of the iron supply meant that Carnegie's bridge construction business would not be reliant on mining or extracting businesses for iron like their rivals. In addition to improving their margins, this allowed Carnegie additional control over the entire process. As the bridge was constructed, he would use his contacts in the railroad sector to gain profit there as well. He was essentially running a triangle of three businesses that complemented one another. An extraction mining company comes first. Second, a company that built bridges and utilized the iron his mining company supplied. His third firm would later become profitable by selling rail when the bridge had been constructed. The theory executed flawlessly. Always on the lookout for the next big chance, Andrew set his sights on New York City, the indisputable global commercial hub. He went to the city expecting to encounter a culture of hustle and meet other eminent businessmen, but what he got was disappointment. Around him, the wealthy people were referred to as scoundrels by him. Carnegie promised himself in a note that he would retire in 2 years, at the age of 35, and devote his time to improving the world. Yet this note would remain unanswered. Steel could now be produced in large quantities, previously thought to be impossible, thanks to Henry Bessemer's invention of the Bessemer converter, a pear-shaped furnace in 1856. The ability to construct enormous steel structures would finally become practical, eventually giving rise to the first skyscrapers and forever altering the skyline of the city. The first steel plants in America were successfully built by Carnegie, who moved with lightning speed. He did this by appointing the finest engineers and architects money could buy. He had an obsessive concentration on productivity, always utilizing the most recent technology and pushing his staff to the limit of their physical and mental skills. He was also renowned for hiring workers and forcing them to work 364 days a year with only one day off on July 4. He would look for opportunities to replace his staff with machines as technology continued to progress. Machines didn't require sleep like men did. They did not attempt to unionize, nor did they want raises. A brilliant salesperson, Carnegie chose to rename the company J. Edgar Thomson Steelwork instead of Carnegie Steel, in honor of one of his railroad sector clients. Carnegie anticipated that naming a steel mill after a client would demonstrate his gratitude for their patronage and, perhaps, lead to increased railroad business, and so it was. The first order from Thomson was for 2,000 steel rails, proving that naming a mill after a client wasn't just a marketing ploy. It was a component of a bigger plan to publicly express gratitude to people. Those deeds would continue to reap enormous rewards throughout the Titan's history. He would hire Henry Clay Frick, a ruthless businessman renowned for his attention to detail and the bottom line, to assist in managing Carnegie steel mills. Together, Carnegie and Frick were a formidable force to be feared. Go no further than the tale of Duquesne Works to demonstrate just how cruel the two could be. Frick assisted Carnegie in spreading the myth that Duquesne's mills was producing subpar steel. Even though that wasn't true, it didn't matter. Kane's railroad clients, according to Carnegie, had tracks that lacked what he called homogeneity. Even if very few people genuinely understood what the word meant, it didn't matter. In order to scare off railroads who were worried that they weren't obtaining high-quality products, Carnegie used the word since it sounded frightening enough to do so. Duquesne would eventually lose money and run out of money if sales halted. Carnegie and Frick would continue to undercut Duquesne on price, further pressuring the company in an effort to hasten their collapse. Duquesne had no choice but to sell to Carnegie at a steep discount after 2 years, when its finances were in ruins. The ground rules of the game for Frick and Carnegie were clear: do whatever it takes to win. But as they quickly learned at one of their biggest steel facilities in Homestead, Pennsylvania, this ruthlessness came at a high cost. Homestead's efficiency had just been improved by millions of dollars invested by Carnegie, allowing it to produce more steel than any other mill of a similar size. Labor costs, however, were still a component of the profit machine that needed to be optimized. For Carnegie, who was trying to change his reputation from a tyrannical steel industry magnate to a supporter of workers' rights, this proved to be difficult. Thus, rather than jeopardizing his reputation, he would delegate the dirty work to his right-hand subordinate Henry Frick. Meanwhile, Carnegie would put himself out of the public's eye by visiting Scotland, where he was born. After reducing salaries for 10,000 already disgruntled low-paid workers, Carnegie was aware that he wouldn't want to be near the plant. Once an ever-widening wealth disparity continued to deepen in 1892, tensions between mill owners and workers were particularly heightened. As never before in American history, the wealthiest citizens of the country were amassing fortunes at an unprecedented rate. Workers believed that a union was the only way for them to have their voice heard since they felt like the wealthy owned them. It got worse when Frick, who followed Carnegie's directions, insisted on more manufacturing output, which meant longer hours of toil. In addition, Frick would decrease their income rather than increase it, which was the cherry on top. The strikers in Homestead, who were at their ugliest, also demanded safer working conditions for a valid cause. 9% of all steel workers would perish on the job in the year 1898. Frick decided to lock out all of the workers and replace them with an immigrant group who would be ready to perform the risky jobs for less when the workers rejected his aggressive requests for longer hours and lower pay. Frick hired a 300-man army for hire, known as the Pinkertons, to accompany the immigrant employees as they traveled to the factory. They arrived at the factory armed with firearms, only to be confronted by 10,000 irate strikers who wouldn't give up the place they called home. Whom fired the first shot is unknown to historians, but we do know that the day would later come to be known as the Homestead Massacre rather than the Homestead Strike. 9 industrial workers and 7 Pinkertons will perish by the time the battle is through. Many injuries would result. The governor issued an order for 8,000 militiamen to act as backup due to the intense battles. Unfortunately for the workers at Carnegie, the factory would reopen with the same safety regulations, longer hours, and lesser pay under the protection of the state's forces. Prior to the tragedies at Homestead, Carnegie's reputation suffered a collateral loss as a result of the disaster. In public, he frequently argued for higher wages and better working conditions in steel mills, yet his words and deeds were rarely in sync. Although he advocated for higher pay and safer working conditions, hypocrisy was rife. He did little to nothing to make his plants a safer place to work while simultaneously lowering labor costs by slashing compensation to make his factories a safer place to work. For using Frick as a scapegoat for the catastrophe, as well as for all the other nefarious actions that he didn't want his name to be associated with, Carnegie was widely criticized as being cowardly. But despite the conflicts and hostility, the steel industry is nevertheless thriving. The corporation would really generate more steel by 1900 than the entire country of Great Britain. But in 1901, Carnegie became weary of the game and preferred to spend time with his wife and daughter. A rising rival in the steel sector was financier J.P. Morgan. However, when he approached 70 years old, Carnegie started to consider selling the business he had devoted his entire life to founding. What Carnegie would accept was noted on a scrap of paper. The proposition was presented to Morgan by Carnegie Steel's president, Charles Schwab. According to this story, J.P. Morgan gave the offer a quick glance before accepting it. For $480 million, Morgan would purchase Carnegie Steel, making Carnegie the world's richest man at the time. Carnegie decided to fully sever all links to his professional life and devote himself entirely to philanthropy. His family would receive nothing at all. Given that Andrew had only completed 5 years of formal education, it is believed that his fondness for libraries had a role in his ability to become financially successful. He gave more than 2,500 libraries to towns and cities all around the world during his lifetime. But he didn't just give to promote himself. He also gave to be kind. Over 500 of the libraries merely had his name on display. Among New York's most famous buildings in an 1891 construction, Carnegie Hall is one illustration of his generosity. The Music Hall was the name given to the structure when it was completed and gifted by Carnegie. The current name was not adopted until after his passing. Not at his urging, but rather by way of the Music Hall's board of directors. And from 1901 until his passing in Lenox, Massachusetts, Carnegie's full-time occupation was dispersing the enormous wealth he had amassed for himself. The story's introduction claimed that Carnegie was a man who was as complex as he was wealthy. Does he use unfair labor practices to maintain the highest possible profit in his factories? Yes. Was he being dishonest? No doubt. Did he fabricate defamation to drive his rivals out of business? Absolutely. All of these things are true, but Carnegie's charitable contributions have also had a significant impact. How can a guy commit such faults and then become a saint is, to put it mildly, puzzling. He may have thought that giving his money away would make up for his transgressions in business. That concludes today's video on YTPioneers. If you could share this video and give it a like if you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate it. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already for more enlightening and inspiring videos. Until then, we'll see you in the next video.